Thank you very much. Let's begin with a little levity, an interactive exercise for fun. By a show of hands, please, who here in, say, the last 6 months has watched or streamed either a cable or network crime drama of some kind? Criminal Minds, Law and Order SVU, Sherlock, NCIS, CSI. Yeah. And you thought I was going to judge you. But the reality is we all watch them. They're guilty pleasures. If nothing else, they make for a great hour of diversion, a great hour of escapism before we go back to our lives. And on that note, consider, traditionally speaking, crime dramas consist of 22 one-hour episodes per season, where the crime of the week, almost always murder, is wrapped up conveniently in that same hour, or 44 and a half minutes after commercials. But what if in 10 or 11 of those episodes, or in some seasons, 15 or 16 of those episodes, your favorite protagonist let the killer get away with it? What if half the time, half the season, you didn't know how the story ended, or if it ended at all? On that note, let me show and tell you what you won't see on television. This is what we call the murder curve. It's something that, when I was a police officer as a mid-career cop, gave me a real crisis of faith. Something that kept me up at night, and still does. Something that hammered home the discrepancy between the mythology of police work and criminal investigations and its day-to-day reality. It's a standard XY graph, but in this case, one that depicts the plummeting solved rate, or what we call the clearance rate for murder on this continent over the last 50 years. Have a look. The truth is, we solve fewer murders per capita today than we did 45 years ago. Before DNA, before centralized fingerprint and ballistics databases, before watch lists or registries or any of the automated forensic technologies we take for granted. The technologies we think will keep us safe. And no one knows why. What we do know, if you have a look at the graph, is that 2016 marked the lowest solved rate in recorded history. There were fewer murderers apprehended in the United States in 2016 than there were in 1935, before any of these technologies. At just over 50% nationally, and even lower than that in some cities. 1 in 2 killers were never even identified. We're not talking about suspected and not arrested, or arrested and prosecuted and then acquitted on some technicality. Nationwide, 1 in 2 never identified walking the streets, including, by the way, an estimated 3,000 serial killers still at large. Based on this arithmetic, someone actually figured out a few years ago, depending where you live or work, you're likely to, whether directly or indirectly, interact with, cross paths with, drive past, walk past, swipe left or swipe right past, up to 16 serial killers in your lifetime. One way or another, 16 of these people will enter your orbit, and if you're lucky, you won't even know it. Do I have your attention yet? Well, it seized my attention a few years ago, and I knew there had to be a better way. I knew this was a problem. You see, everyone is obsessed with the total number of murders. The media, politicians, they talk about X number of murders this year compared to X number last year, or the murder rate in this city is X times what it is in this other city. But this is the question no one is asking, is what happens to those cases? Where do they go? How many get solved? So that was my crisis of faith, like I mentioned. I watched as so many murders went unsolved, not because they were unsolvable. They didn't hit a wall in the conventional sense, or like you see on television. Most actually just fizzled out for some comparatively less glamorous and heroic reason. They would fall victim to competing resources, a complete lack of resources, interpersonal conflict, a lack of political will, or just plain old bureaucracy. That's really why most murders go unsolved. And when they go unsolved long enough, people start to forget. People forget long enough what was once an active investigation into a life stolen goes into stasis, goes into hibernation, proverbial refrigeration. That's why we call them cold cases. And that's precisely why I founded the Cold Case Society at Western University, a think tank, an interdisciplinary group of professors and students who 2 times a week leave their regularly scheduled lives to apply their expertise, whether existing expertise or emerging or burgeoning expertise, and most importantly, their passion for cold cases, for unsolved mysteries. They leverage the full intellectual and technological might of a major university campus, which is one-stop shopping for every forensic science conceivable. And in the last few years have turned it into the most badass after-school club on the planet. It's true. Think of us as a diverse group of intellectuals who range from astronomers to zoologists, engineers to English literature professors, all united in the cause for finding answers. And students in those disciplines, and many more. Students who bring fresh eyes and new perspectives to these mysteries, who know nothing about bureaucracy. All they know is possibility. Millennial mind hunters who will enter the minds and do enter the minds of killers whose crimes date back to before they were even born. So that was my call to action. That was the solution to my crisis of faith. So while still a cop and later a detective by night, I went back to graduate school by day, doing first a master's degree and then a PhD, forging a new trail, breaking new ground in applied criminology, and yet the whole time getting back in touch with my first degree, which was not in criminology, but believe it or not, in archaeology. And that's because before I thought I wanted to become a cop, I wanted to be Indiana Jones. It's true. And then I realized they're kind of already the same thing. You see, archaeology is, of course, the study of our collective past through its artifacts, its remnants. Relics unearthed and studied in contemporary times that tell us stories about earlier societies, how they lived and how they died. And that's precisely what cold cases are. An excavation of the past and its most puzzling and painful mysteries. So I thought if I could overlay that philosophy, that archaeological methodology onto unsolved murders, elevate cold cases from being just paper files or bankers' boxes collecting dust, and make them artifacts worthy of scientific scrutiny, subject to the scientific method, I could turn cold case studies into its own academic discipline, into its own field of scholarship. And this was initially very exciting for a number of people, law enforcement, other academics, and the families of these victims. There were some skeptics. There were some people who said, how are you going to make cold case studies its own field? And my response was basic math again. There are about 1,800 specimens in the dinosaur fossil record. No one debates paleontology being a field, an area of scientific expertise. There are over 250,000 cold cases on this continent in the last 40 years alone. It's an issue of scalability. There are also people who were worried naturally that if this is a program at a university, I'm just going to be like a prolonged episode of Scooby-Doo, churning out meddling kid after meddling kid year after year who will be out running amok. But very quickly, our results said otherwise. I remember just a few months into this initiative, I'm sitting in my office, and a report from a student in the club society comes across my desk, and I realized very quickly it contains a very lengthy transcript of what appears to be a telephone call. I soon realized the subject, the recipient of this call, placed by a student, is a suspected serial killer who's been on the run since 1968 when he absconded in May of that year from his police polygraph in New York City. Thought to be dead, but located, interviewed through a one-party consent recording and a confession elicited from a student. And that's when I realized this could change everything. I also took a serious knuckle rapping by the university's administration. It turns out students communicating directly with serial killers is frowned upon. And yet here we are, stronger than ever, still standing. Still standing. And beyond our own successes, I look to other successes born out of the same philosophy that drives us, the creative engine that keeps us going. I look to the retired, for instance, patent attorney and amateur genealogist, a field no one thought would have any forensic applicability just even a few years ago. And yet in the last 12 months, she has closed 15 cold case murders using genealogy, including, by the way, catching the alleged Golden State Killer, one of the most elusive serial murderers on record. So with these successes and the possibility of this in mind, amid this problem, I want you to start thinking about law enforcement and criminal investigations differently. Not about privatization or deregulation even, but about democratization, disruption. This is one of the last industries that has not been disrupted. We will always need the men and women in blue, but what about you? What about you? And I ask that because the next frontier for the Cold Case Society is beyond the university, and it's in the workplace. You may be doing work like that genealogist I mentioned, like my students, right now, that can be leveraged to help with the mission. Start pulling the solved rate out of the basement. Your work right now could make a difference. And if not, okay. What are you doing after work? Because I know what my students and I and other professors are doing. You can join an ultimate Frisbee league, or you can join a league of extraordinary crime fighters. It's time to get in touch with your inner crime fighter. The reality is this: an estimated 95% of all crime is solved through some form of citizen engagement and involvement. And that's really what this is. Just take it to a higher plane. People are looking for meaning, for something beyond their 9 to 5. This could be your calling. We need all the help we can get. And now you may say, okay, Mike, that makes sense. But you know what? As disingenuous and as fictitious as television may be, that's how I prefer to deal with crime. Vicariously, passively, from a safe viewing distance. I'm not really interested, and I don't think I have the temperament for real life crime. And to that I say, maybe so. But I'll tell you this: real life crime is sure as hell interested in you. So it's up to you what you want to do about that. But I would suggest sitting idly by is not an option. As I just explained, we are solving fewer murders today than ever. 250,000 on this continent in the last 2 generations alone. 250,000 killers still walking around. This has nothing to do with reinventing the wheel, quitting what you're doing, and going and becoming a cop. This has everything to do with not being a cop and doing what you're already doing. Everyone has value and expertise they can impart for this mission. Mission control will always be at Western University, but the idea is to have satellite teams all over the place. So remember, and take it from me, you are never too old, and it is never too late to join an after-school club. Thank you very much.